The clock has been ticking for Iran to stop enriching uranium or face broader sanctions from the United Nations. Today, the deadline came and went with Iran as defiant as ever, insisting it's making electricity, not nuclear weapons. But the United States doesn't trust Iran, and that political dynamic reminded the CBC's Joe Schlesinger of the early 1970s when he was in China.
It was a stunner. Here was Richard Nixon, who had built his career on fierce anti-communism, communing in Beijing with Mao Zedong, the most radical communist of them all. It was as if George W. Bush were to go to Pyongyang today to have tea with Kim Jong-il. China at the time was a hermit kingdom at odds with the whole world, and much of the world, most notably the United States and the United Nations, wouldn't even recognize Mao's regime. Internally, the country was torn apart by the viciousness of his Cultural Revolution. Then Nixon came along, bogged down in an unwinnable war in Vietnam, abetted by both China and the Soviet Union. He decided to drive a wedge into the communist camp. So the red beta suddenly turned colorblind and ignored all the red flags around him. In doing so, he changed the course of history and helped open the country to the world. In a way, the transformation of a hobbled China into the booming country it is today started the day that Richard Nixon came to China. 6 presidents later, the U.S. is again led by a man who sees threats everywhere. For George Bush, it's been not reds under beds, but Iraq, North Korea, and Iran.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Regime change became the catchword of the day. First on the list, Iraq. Now the U.S. is facing a war in Iraq as intractable as the Vietnam conflict. For all that, though, Bush has continued to talk tough.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens.
North Korea reacted to the threat by escalating its program to build and test nuclear weapons. In return for halting his nuclear buildup, Kim Jong-il demanded foreign aid and direct talks with the Americans to guarantee his survival. Bush would have none of it. Instead of bilateral talks with the Americans, the North Koreans got a 6-nation talk fest in Beijing. They talked for 3 years and got nowhere. As the situation in Iraq got worse, though, the Americans had second thoughts. They invited the North Koreans to meet them in Berlin, alone, just the two of them. And so they did. No fanfare, mind you, no celebration, or even a photo op. Just 2 second-tier diplomats meeting in secret. But it worked. After that, it was back to Beijing and a quick endorsement by the group of 6. The agreement is no blockbuster. If the Americans had not been stonewalling, they probably could have had this deal years ago. Nor is it a sure thing. It's more like a cautious, slow-mo dance of baby steps.
North Korea does a little, we do a little. They do more, we do more. That's the mechanism that can ensure North Korean compliance with this deal.
All this still leaves the third member of Bush's axis of evil, Iran, in a state of suspense and danger. For the last 3 days, the Iranians have been staging war games to show their defiance of a UN Security Council deadline that expired today for Iran to halt uranium enrichment or face economic sanctions. The entire Iranian nation, President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad told a rally yesterday, is resisting steadfastly and will defend its nuclear rights until the end. President Bush, for his part, has insisted there would be consequences for Iran's defiance.
And we must not allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon.
Bush has sent a force of 30 warships into the Persian Gulf to confront the Iranians. For Bush, Iran is now his greatest diplomatic test. Attacking Iran, which doesn't have nuclear weapons, could, apart from being potentially disastrous militarily, shred the last of Bush's political legitimacy. What George W. Bush needs right now are the diplomatic smarts of the man they called Tricky Dicky, Richard Milhous Nixon. For The National, I'm Joe Schlesinger.